This small-town baker thought she won the opportunity of a lifetime. But what if it was all a lie? Claire steps into a world of billionaires, private beaches and insane luxury, falling for Daniel Sinclair, a billionaire who seems perfect, until she discovers the truth. He chose her, he planned it all. Now, she's caught between a love that feels real and a betrayal that cuts deep. Will she trust him again? Or is this love story about to crash harder than a private jet? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Stay until the end to see how it all unfolds, because you won't believe the ending. Claire Parker had never won anything in her life. Not a free coffee, not a raffle at the town fair, and certainly not a weekend at one of the world's most exclusive estates. So when the letter arrived, with a gold-embossed invitation and everything, she figured it was a joke, or worse, a scam. The letter felt heavy in her hands, somehow making the whole thing feel more real, yet still absurd. Sinclair Estate. The name shimmered at her, promising things she could only imagine in quick, unfiltered flashes. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, more forks at the table than she'd know what to do with. It was a world far from her cozy bakery, with its mismatched chairs and the faint smell of cinnamon that clung to her skin even after she left for the day. Her best friend, Mia, laughed when she saw Claire's stunned expression. "Are you kidding me? You're actually debating going?" Claire shot her a look. "It's just extravagant. Do you realize the kind of people who go to these things? Probably billionaires, CEOs, people who wouldn't know a muffin from a cupcake." She laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, because in her mind, she could already see herself tripping over designer heels in a room full of silk-clad strangers. Mia rolled her eyes. "Come on, Claire. You've been working nonstop for years. You deserve this, a weekend away from flour dust and dough. Go experience some luxury, and who knows, maybe you'll meet your Prince Charming." Claire scoffed, though her cheeks flushed. "Right, a prince. He'd probably be a duke at best, knowing my luck." But the wheels in her mind were turning, and even as she tossed the letter into her bag with an exaggerated shrug, a tiny flicker of curiosity had sparked. 3 days later, she was driving through winding roads lined with towering sycamores, the leaves filtering sunlight in golden patches that danced across her car's dashboard. A nervous energy buzzed under her skin, mixing excitement with disbelief. What was she doing here? Her life was as straightforward as the recipe for apple pie. Work hard, keep things simple, and maybe, just maybe, save enough to expand her little bakery one day. As she approached the entrance to Sinclair Estate, however, simple went out the window. The iron gates were more elaborate than any she'd seen, with intricate swirls that looked like they were designed to keep mere mortals out. And she was about to drive right through them. A guard greeted her with a polite nod and a "Welcome, Ms. Parker," before waving her into a world she never dreamed she'd enter. Her car crunched over gravel, each turn bringing a new gasp. The mansion rose ahead of her like something out of a storybook, all cream-colored stone, ivy-covered walls, and windows that seemed to sparkle under the sun. Beyond it, the grounds stretched out in perfectly manicured lawns dotted with marble statues and fountains that looked like they belonged in Europe rather than the Hamptons. "Wow," Claire whispered, gripping the steering wheel to steady herself. She could barely process it all, and she hadn't even stepped inside yet. A valet appeared by her door, and she handed him the keys, feeling oddly out of place in her comfortable sweater and jeans. He nodded with a faint smile, taking her luggage as she tried to soak in every detail without looking like a total fish out of water. Inside was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting prisms of light that danced on the marble floors. The air smelled faintly of something expensive, a mix of polished wood and roses, and everything gleamed like it had just been meticulously dusted by 100 invisible hands. Every step echoed in a way that made her feel both grand and absurdly small. "Ms. Parker?" A woman with a sleek bun and an even sleeker black suit approached her with a practiced smile. "My name is Lillian, and I'll be assisting you this weekend. Mr. Sinclair will be hosting a private dinner for the guests this evening. He's thrilled you could join us." "Mr. Sinclair?" Claire's mind jumped straight to the shadowy figure behind this whole extravagant event. She'd read that Daniel Sinclair was a reclusive billionaire, someone with a reputation for hosting these weekends but rarely appearing at them himself. He was a mystery wrapped in rumors, and yet, here she was being introduced into his world. Lillian gave a polite nod. Yes, Mr. Daniel Sinclair, our esteemed host. She gestured for Claire to follow, leading her down a hallway where even the wallpaper seemed more valuable than her entire bakery back home. After a tour that felt like a marathon, Lillian pointing out rooms and wings with names Claire would never remember, she finally had a chance to settle into her suite. And what a suite it was. Gold-accented mirrors, a bed that looked softer than a cloud, and windows that opened to a view of the private beach. It was beautiful, but it also felt like a life borrowed from someone else. That evening, as she slipped into a dress she'd bought specifically for this weekend, a delicate blue number that cost her more than she wanted to admit, she felt a strange mixture of nerves and anticipation. The private dinner would be her first real encounter with this mysterious Daniel Sinclair and his world of excess. Standing in front of the mirror, she forced herself to breathe, smoothing down the dress. "You've got this, Claire. Just don't trip on the carpet and you'll be fine." But as she made her way down to the dining hall, her heart pounded. She entered a room lit by a breathtaking chandelier, with tables set with more silverware than she'd ever seen. And then her gaze landed on him, Daniel Sinclair. He was nothing like she expected, more rugged than refined, with piercing eyes that seemed to hold secrets she couldn't begin to understand. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, but there was an unpolished edge to him, like he hadn't entirely bought into the life he was living. Their eyes met, just for a second, but in that heartbeat, Claire felt a tremor, a pulse of something she couldn't quite name. His gaze held hers a moment longer than it should have, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. And just like that, in a room filled with wealth and opulence, Claire Parker realized she might be in for more than just a luxurious weekend. Claire woke the next morning to sunlight streaming in through her suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow across the room that made everything look impossibly dreamlike. She sat up slowly, blinking, wondering for a moment if she was still dreaming. But there it was, the extravagant bed draped in silk, the plush carpet beneath her feet, and the elegant furnishings that belonged to a life she'd only glimpsed on magazine covers. "This is real," she reminded herself. "You're really here." A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. It was Lillian, perfectly polished even at this early hour, holding a silver tray with coffee, fresh pastries, and an invitation in an embossed envelope. "Good morning, Ms. Parker. Mr. Sinclair has organized a tour of the estate for all our guests this morning. You'll find the details in your invitation," Lillian said with a warm but practiced smile. "I'll be here to guide you down when you're ready." "Thank you," Claire replied, still half in a daze as she took the envelope. She watched Lillian disappear down the hall, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. There was something surreal about having people waiting on her, addressing her as though she were someone important. Claire let herself savor a few sips of coffee and a buttery croissant before opening the envelope. The card inside was simple, embossed with Daniel Sinclair's initials. A handwritten note inside read, "I hope you enjoy today's tour. There's more to Sinclair Estate than meets the eye. DS." Her fingers brushed the ink, lingering on his initials. She wasn't sure what to make of this cryptic note, but she was curious, maybe more than she wanted to admit. Daniel Sinclair was a mystery she hadn't asked to solve, yet she felt herself drawn to the challenge, wondering what lay behind his cool, enigmatic exterior. And the tour gathered in the grand foyer, where the other guests milled about in outfits that screamed luxury without even trying. Claire suddenly felt self-conscious in her simple white sundress, though it was one of her favorites. She reminded herself that she wasn't here to impress anyone, just to enjoy a weekend, as out of her element as she might be. She glanced around, wondering if Daniel would be there to lead the tour himself. She hadn't seen him since the private dinner, though the memory of his gaze, steady, assessing, as if he saw through every wall she put up, lingered in her mind. "Good morning, everyone." A deep, calm voice rolled through the foyer, and there he was, Daniel Sinclair, looking every bit the part of the host yet somehow still detached, as if he were simply observing his own event from the outside. He wore a navy blazer, crisp and perfectly tailored, yet there was a quiet ruggedness about him, a subtle, unrefined edge that set him apart from the other men in the room. He addressed the guests with a reserved but polite welcome, outlining the day's events in smooth, practiced tones. His gaze swept over the group, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes found Claire's. A flicker of warmth softened his otherwise unreadable expression, but just as quickly, it was gone. The tour began. led by Lillian but with Daniel trailing close behind, adding small details now and then. They moved through grand rooms and corridors, each more elaborate than the last. Claire found herself marveling at everything. The towering library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the ballroom with glittering chandeliers, and a dining hall with a table long enough to seat an entire village. Daniel walked slightly behind, seemingly content to observe, rather than lead. At one point he caught up to her, falling into step beside her as they moved into a smaller, quieter wing of the estate. "Are you enjoying the tour?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Claire was momentarily startled, then nodded. "It's overwhelming, in a beautiful way. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this." He smiled faintly, a hint of something softer beneath his composed facade. "It can be, yes. Sometimes even I forget what's here." "Really?" she said, surprised. "I'd imagine you'd know every inch of this place." Daniel glanced at the walls, his expression unreadable. "It's easy to know a place by its layout, harder to feel connected to it." There was a weight in his words that surprised her. It made her wonder what kind of life he led within these gilded walls, if they felt more like a cage than a home. They continued in silence, passing through the art gallery where priceless paintings lined the walls. She caught him watching her as she studied the pieces, as if waiting to see what she thought of them. Claire felt a strange sense of being examined, but not in a judgmental way. More like he was trying to understand something about her that went beyond what she'd said. "Do you enjoy art?" he asked finally. Claire nodded. "In my own way. But I can't say I know much about it. Mostly, I like things that feel honest." Daniel arched a brow, his interest piqued. "Honest? Art that doesn't try too hard. The kind that's beautiful just because it is, not because it's meant to impress." She hesitated, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Sorry, that probably sounds silly." "Not at all," he replied, his gaze intent. "I think more people feel that way than you might realize." She looked back at the painting in front of them, a landscape, simple and unpretentious, with colors that seemed to reach out and pull you in. And in that quiet moment, she felt something shift, like she was starting to understand this man, whose world was so foreign to her own. The tour concluded at a private garden, with views that stretched to the cliffs and ocean beyond. While the other guests mingled, sipping champagne and chatting in elegant clusters, Claire found herself drifting to the edge of the garden, breathing in the salty air. She didn't expect Daniel to follow her, but a few minutes later, there he was, his presence grounding yet oddly unsettling. "Did you know," he said quietly as they both looked out over the cliffs, "that this garden was my mother's favorite part of the estate?" Claire glanced at him, surprised by the openness in his tone. "No, I didn't. She used to spend hours here," he continued, almost to himself. "Said it reminded her of the one place she felt truly free. I guess I come here for the same reason." Claire felt a pang of empathy, sensing an echo of loneliness in his words. "It's a beautiful place," she offered gently. "You're lucky to have it." Daniel looked at her, a flicker of something raw and real breaking through. "Maybe. But sometimes, it's not the place that makes you feel free. It's the people you share it with." Their eyes held, and in that brief silence, Claire felt the distance between their worlds shrink just a little. In this garden, surrounded by opulence yet grounded by something genuine, she sensed the beginnings of an understanding, and maybe something even deeper. The rest of the day drifted by in a luxurious haze. Claire wandered the estate grounds, exploring hidden nooks and archways, letting herself get swept up in the charm and grandeur of it all. It was a strange kind of beauty, one that felt both seductive and unnervingly hollow at times. For every room filled with priceless art, there was a shadowy corner, a quiet stillness that made her wonder what stories this place held, buried beneath its perfect veneer. She was just beginning to settle into her room that evening, when there was a soft knock at her door. Claire opened it to find Lillian, who held out a small cream-colored envelope with a knowing smile. "This just arrived for you, Ms. Parker," she said, her tone hinting at something more. Claire took the envelope, her heartbeat quickening. "Thank you, Lillian." As soon as she was alone, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, with handwriting she recognized from the note that had come with her invitation. It was Daniel's. "Ms. Parker, if you're interested in seeing the estate from a different perspective, I'd like to invite you for a private tour tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Daniel." A private tour. With Daniel. Her heart skipped. a mix of excitement and nerves swelling within her. She hadn't expected to make an impression on him, not when she was surrounded by the kind of people who fit effortlessly into his world. The next morning, Claire found herself dressed in her most polished outfit, a simple but flattering sundress paired with flats that wouldn't make her feel like an imposter. She made her way to the garden where he'd told her to meet him, feeling a mixture of nerves and anticipation. The estate's beauty seemed even more enchanting in the morning light, casting a warm glow over the perfectly manicured lawns and blooming flowers. Daniel was already there, dressed in a casual button-down shirt, his demeanor more relaxed than the previous day. When he saw her approach, he offered a slight, genuine smile, the kind that lit up his eyes just enough to make him look almost approachable. "Good morning, Ms. Parker," he greeted her, his voice carrying a hint of warmth she hadn't heard before. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, trying to keep her tone steady. "Call me Daniel," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting. "After all, I don't think we're much for formalities, are we?" Claire let out a small laugh. "Fair enough, Daniel." As they began to walk, Daniel guided her down a path that wound away from the main estate. They passed sculptures hidden among trees, quiet alcoves that seemed like they belonged in fairy tales, and little bridges that arched over streams that glistened in the morning light. It was a different side of Sinclair Estate, less polished, more organic, as if these places had grown wild, untouched by wealth's heavy hand. "This part of the estate isn't shown to most guests," Daniel explained as they reached a secluded pond. "My mother loved these hidden places. She said they were where the estate's heart was." Claire sensed a wistful note in his voice. "She must have been an incredible woman." "She was," he replied softly. "She saw the world differently. She was kind, curious. She'd probably be much more at ease with you than with the people I usually host here." Claire felt her cheeks flush. "You make it sound like I'm some rare creature." "In a way you are," he replied, and there was no humor in his voice. Only a strange intensity that made her feel both seen and vulnerable. They continued down the path in silence, reaching an old gazebo covered in ivy. Daniel paused and turned to face her. "Can I ask you something, Claire?" She nodded, caught off guard by the directness in his gaze. "Why did you accept the invitation?" His eyes searched hers, as if trying to uncover the answer before she could speak. Claire hesitated, surprised by the question. "Honestly, I don't know. I think I wanted to see what it felt like, just once, to live in a world like this, and maybe to see if there was anything in it I might want for myself." "And?" He pressed gently, a glimmer of curiosity softening his expression. "And?" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think I'm starting to realize that maybe it's not about the things here. Maybe it's more about the people, and the stories they carry." A look crossed his face, something between surprise and understanding. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "Most people come here to be dazzled. Few ever think to look beyond that." They walked on, sharing snippets of conversation that felt unexpectedly natural, like the rhythm of two people who had known each other longer than a few hours. Claire found herself lowering her guard, letting him see parts of her she usually kept hidden. When they reached a small, ancient-looking greenhouse tucked into a hillside, Daniel paused. "This was my mother's favorite place," he said, opening the door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and herbs, a contrast to the estate's usual manicured floral arrangements. "It's beautiful," Claire whispered, running her fingers over the petals of a delicate violet. "She used to say that these were her roots," he murmured, watching her closely, "that everything here was real, untouched." She felt that this greenhouse was a reminder of what life could be like, outside of all this. He gestured around them, as if he couldn't quite name the world he was part of. Claire looked at him, feeling a pang of empathy. "I think I can understand that. It's hard to be surrounded by so much and feel like none of it belongs to you, isn't it?" His gaze flicked to her, a look of surprise crossing his face. "Yes, exactly." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, letting the silence speak for them. There was an unspoken connection between them, one born of shared understanding, even though their worlds were so different. As they made their way back toward the main estate, Daniel hesitated. "Claire, I'd like to invite you to a private dinner tomorrow evening. Just the two of us." Her heart skipped, caught off guard by the invitation. "Oh, yes. Yes, I'd love to." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. I'll have Lillian bring the details to you." They parted at the edge of the garden, and Claire watched him disappear down a path lined with wildflowers. A flutter of excitement warmed her as she headed back to her room, her mind buzzing with the morning's events. This wasn't just a luxurious weekend anymore. Somehow, in ways she couldn't explain, it had become something more. The private dinner was set in one of the Sinclair estate's smaller dining rooms, though small by estate standards, still meant a high-ceilinged room with a view of the ocean framed by towering glass windows. A chandelier cast a warm glow over the room, and the table was set with silverware so polished Claire could see her reflection in it. She felt a nervous thrill just looking at the place settings. She'd never been part of a world where a dinner for two involved more cutlery than a wedding reception. Daniel was already there when she entered, dressed in a dark suit that gave him an air of understated power. Yet, there was something more relaxed in his posture, an openness that hadn't been there before. He stood as she approached, his gaze steady but softened. "You look beautiful, Claire," he said, his voice low and genuine. She felt her cheeks heat up, grateful for the soft lighting. "Thank you. This whole setting is breathtaking." He smiled, a hint of self-consciousness flickering in his eyes. "I suppose it can be, but sometimes it feels like a cage gilded in gold." His words caught her off guard. A cage? He gestured for her to sit, taking his own seat across from her. When you grow up in a place like this, people expect certain things. They see you as someone who has everything, but they don't realize that everything can sometimes feel like nothing when it's forced upon you. Claire looked at him, seeing a side of him she hadn't expected. "So, all this isn't freedom for you?" Daniel exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the window. "It can be, I suppose, but it comes with expectations, responsibilities. It's easy to get lost in them, to lose sight of what truly matters." They paused as the server arrived, placing dishes in front of them with an elegance Claire had only seen in movies. The food was delicate and beautifully presented, each plate a work of art, but she found herself more drawn to the man across from her than the food itself. "So, what does matter to you then?" she asked gently, her curiosity genuine. He looked down, as if searching for an answer he'd long since buried. "I used to think it was about proving myself, taking the legacy my parents left and making it grow, making it something bigger. But somewhere along the way, I think I started to lose sight of me." His words lingered in the air, heavy with an honesty that made her chest tighten. She'd assumed he was like any other wealthy, distant billionaire, but this was something else. She sensed a depth to him, a longing that mirrored her own yearning for meaning. "It sounds like a lot to carry," she said softly. "I can't imagine what that would feel like, being surrounded by so much, but feeling like it's not really yours." He looked up at her, his gaze piercing yet vulnerable. "That's exactly it. It's like being a guest in your own life. You're here, but it doesn't belong to you." They fell into a comfortable silence, their shared understanding creating an unspoken bond. The server returned with a second course, but neither of them paid much attention to the food. It was as if the room itself had shrunk, leaving only the two of them, their worlds overlapping in a way that felt both impossible and undeniable. After dinner, Daniel led her through a different part of the estate, down a narrow, dimly lit hallway that opened up into a library unlike anything she'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with volumes that looked as if they'd been untouched for decades. There was an air of mystery to the room, a quiet sanctuary hidden away from the grandeur of the rest of the estate. "This was my mother's favorite room," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She'd spend hours here, lost in these books." Claire looked around, awestruck. "It's beautiful. Feels like a place you could hide away from the world." Daniel's gaze softened. "That's exactly what she did. She once told me that this room was the only place in the estate where she felt truly free." Claire felt a pang of empathy, thinking of the woman who'd lived in this grand mansion, yet yearned for something simpler, more genuine. She must have been a remarkable person. "She was," he murmured. "She had this way of seeing through all the illusions, straight to what was real. Sometimes I wonder if she'd be disappointed in the life I've chosen." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard, and she reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his arm. "I don't think she would be. I think she'd be proud of you for carrying on what she started, and I think she'd understand the weight of it too." Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was nothing else. Just the two of them. connected by a shared sense of longing and the quiet truth that had formed between them. Daniel broke the silence, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're an unusual guest, Claire. Most people come here to escape their lives, to bask in luxury. You seem to want something else." Claire felt her heart skip, surprised by his observation. "I guess I'm just curious about what lies beneath it all. The things people don't see." His gaze darkened, something unreadable passing over his face. "You may be one of the few people who's ever tried to see it. And maybe the only one I've ever wanted to show it to." Her breath caught at his words, the quiet sincerity in his tone sending a thrill down her spine. There was an intensity between them now, a magnetic pull she couldn't deny. And for the first time, she felt like she was beginning to understand this complicated man, peeling back the layers to see the person beneath the title, the fortune, the reputation. He gestured to a small reading nook in the corner of the room, where a cozy armchair sat beside a coffee table scattered with books. "This was where my mother would read to me as a child. She'd tell me stories, and for a little while, I'd forget who I was supposed to be." Claire sank into the chair, feeling the weight of his words as he stood beside her. The library seemed to shrink around them, creating an intimate cocoon that felt removed from the rest of the world. "What kinds of stories?" she asked softly, her curiosity piqued. He thought for a moment, a faint smile on his lips. She loved myths and legends, tales of people who were larger than life but somehow flawed, human. She used to say that even the greatest heroes had to be vulnerable to be real. Claire's heart swelled at the thought, and she couldn't help but reach for his hand. He looked down at their entwined fingers, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but he didn't pull away. "You know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "maybe that's what you need too. A chance to be vulnerable, to show the world, or maybe just yourself, who you really are." Their eyes met, and she could see the conflict in his gaze, the desire to let her in, battling with a lifetime of guarding himself. And in that quiet moment, Claire realized that beneath his wealth and stoic facade was a man who longed to be seen, to be understood. They stayed like that for a moment longer, wrapped in a silence that spoke louder than words. And as they parted ways that evening, Claire knew one thing for certain. She was beginning to see Daniel Sinclair, not the billionaire, not the host, but the man. And that was a discovery she hadn't anticipated, one that left her heart racing and her mind spinning. The private beach was breathtaking under the night sky. Lanterns dotted the sand, casting a warm glow over the waves that stretched out into darkness. The sound of the ocean was a gentle rhythm, a steady backdrop to the laughter and conversation that drifted from a small bonfire where the other guests had gathered. Claire walked toward the fire, her heart thumping with a nervous excitement that she couldn't quite explain. The night air was crisp, filled with a promise of something she couldn't put her finger on. She spotted Daniel, standing a little ways off from the others, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was dressed casually for once, in a dark sweater and jeans that made him look less like the untouchable billionaire she'd first imagined, and more like someone she might pass on a quiet street in her hometown. Yet there was still an intensity about him, a quiet storm beneath his calm exterior. As she approached, he turned, catching sight of her. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of surprise and warmth that sent a shiver down her spine. "Claire," he greeted her, his voice softer than usual, as if he were meeting her on different, more personal terms tonight. "Hi, Daniel," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm under his gaze. She glanced toward the fire. "Quite a setup you have here." He shrugged, his eyes drifting back toward the ocean. "Just a little gathering. Sometimes I forget how beautiful this place is until I see it through someone else's eyes." They stood in silence, both watching the waves as they lapped against the shore. Claire's heart was pounding, and she couldn't understand why. There was something about the darkness, the quiet intimacy of the night, that made everything feel different, more charged. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Why don't we take a walk?" Without waiting for her answer, he began walking along the shore, and she followed, the sand cool beneath her feet. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft rush of the waves and their footsteps on the sand. Claire felt an unspoken tension between them, a pull that made her chest tighten in anticipation. Finally, he stopped and looked out over the water. "I come here a lot," he said quietly. "When I need to remember what it feels like to be grounded." Claire nodded, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. It must be hard, always having to be the one people look to, the one with all the answers. He let out a soft, bitter laugh. It's not as glamorous as people think. Everyone sees the wealth, the lifestyle, but no one sees the loneliness, the feeling that you're never quite enough for anyone. He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. It's strange, isn't it? To have everything and still feel empty. She looked at him, feeling a pang of empathy she hadn't expected. I can't pretend to understand that kind of life, but I do understand what it's like to feel like something's missing, like you're looking for something you can't name. Daniel's gaze softened, and he took a step closer to her. And what are you looking for, Claire? The question caught her off guard, and she found herself searching for an answer she hadn't even known she wanted to give. I don't know, she admitted, feeling vulnerable under his gaze. I thought I knew what I wanted. My bakery, my simple life. But being here, meeting you, it's made me wonder if I've been playing it safe, if maybe I've been afraid to want more. He nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. Sometimes we build walls around ourselves without even realizing it, and then one day someone comes along and makes you question if those walls are really protecting you or just keeping you from living. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, and Claire felt her heart pound as she looked up at him, feeling closer to him than she ever thought she could. They continued walking, the silence now charged with an unspoken tension. The night was cool, but Claire felt warm, her skin tingling with an awareness that made her acutely conscious of his every movement beside her. When they reached a secluded part of the beach, he paused, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. My mother used to bring me out here, he said quietly, his voice a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. She'd tell me stories, myths about the stars and the gods. I think it was her way of trying to show me there was more to life than just this. He gestured around them, as if encompassing the weight of his life in one small motion. Claire felt a pang of sadness, imagining the lonely boy he must have been, hidden away in this world of wealth and expectations. She sounds like she was a wonderful person, she said softly. She was, he murmured, his gaze distant. She saw beauty in the smallest things, the things no one else noticed. I guess I never really understood that until recently. They stood there, side by side under the stars, their connection deepening in the quiet of the night. For once, the roles they'd fallen into, the reclusive billionaire, the small-town baker, seemed to melt away, leaving just two people who, despite their differences, had found a kindred spirit in one another. Without thinking, Claire reached out and took his hand. He looked down, surprised, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers intertwined with hers, and the simple touch sent a thrill through her, a warmth that chased away the night's chill. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, holding on to each other in the darkness, sharing a quiet moment that felt more intimate than anything she'd ever known. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire, I don't usually let people in like this. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. Neither do I. But I think maybe it's worth the risk. He looked down at her, his gaze intense, and in that moment, she knew that whatever happened next, she'd never forget this night, this feeling. Slowly, he leaned in, and her breath caught as his lips brushed against hers, tentative, testing. And then, as if some invisible wall had crumbled between them, he kissed her, his hand tightening around hers. The world around them disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the way he held her as if she were the only thing that mattered. It was a kiss that felt like a promise, a quiet, unspoken vow that neither of them could deny. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy, his gaze filled with a vulnerability that took her breath away. I don't know what this is, he whispered, but I know I don't want it to end. She smiled, her fingers brushing his cheek. Neither do I. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts racing in sync with the waves crashing against the shore. In that moment, Claire felt as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, something both terrifying and thrilling. And as they made their way back to the bonfire, hand in hand, Claire knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. The next morning, Claire woke up feeling lighter than she had in years. Her heart was still racing from the memory of last night. The beach, the stars, The way Daniel had looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. She had fallen asleep, feeling like she was floating, wondering if maybe, just maybe, something real and lasting could come from this unexpected connection. After breakfast, Claire decided to take a walk through the estate's gardens, hoping to lose herself in the memory of their night together. She rounded a hedge of roses, breathing in their perfume, letting the morning sunlight warm her skin. But just as she turned a corner, her steps faltered. Daniel was there, standing beside a tall, elegant woman dressed in a chic white dress and large sunglasses that gave her an air of effortless glamour. The woman was laughing at something Daniel had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. They looked every bit like they belonged together, a picture-perfect pair of wealth and refinement. Claire felt a pang, an uncomfortable squeeze in her chest. She tried to brush it off, reminding herself that Daniel must know dozens of women like her, friends who'd grown up in his world of privilege and influence. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the connection they'd shared last night had already begun to slip away, that the wall he'd lowered around her was going back up. Before she could slip away unseen, Daniel caught sight of her. His expression changed, his eyes widening slightly as he noticed her. But instead of the warmth she'd come to expect, there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, almost as if he too had been caught off guard. "Claire," he called, a polite smile on his face, though he didn't move away from the woman beside him. "Good morning." She forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Good morning," she replied, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "This is Sophia," he said, gesturing to the woman, who turned and looked at Claire with an assessing, almost indifferent gaze. "She's an old family friend. Sophia, this is Claire Parker, one of our guests this weekend." Sophia tilted her head slightly, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ah, a guest. How charming." Her gaze shifted back to Daniel, and Claire could see the familiarity in it, the way Sophia's hand lingered on his arm as if she had every right to be there. Claire managed a polite nod, feeling her cheeks flush. "Well, I should get going. I didn't mean to interrupt." Daniel's expression softened, and he took a small step toward her. "You weren't interrupting," he said quietly, his gaze searching hers. But his voice held a formality, a distance that hadn't been there last night. Sophia laughed lightly, a sound that grated on Claire's nerves. "I'll steal him back for just a few more minutes if you don't mind, Claire. I have to catch up on everything I've missed." Claire's chest tightened, but she forced a smile and nodded. "Of course. Have a nice day." She turned and walked away, her heart sinking with each step. She tried to brush off the ache gnawing at her chest, reminding herself that she barely knew him, that she had no claim on his time, his attention, his feelings. And yet, after last night, she had let herself hope that maybe she was more than just another guest to him. As the day wore on, Claire found herself drifting through the estate, feeling more like a visitor than she had before. The grandeur, the beauty, all the things that had charmed her now felt hollow, as if the magic had faded with Daniel's polite smile and Sophia's elegant presence. By late afternoon, she decided to clear her head by visiting the beach, hoping that the solitude of the waves would help ease the ache she couldn't quite shake. She sat on the sand, staring out at the ocean, feeling the weight of the distance growing between her and Daniel. She hated herself for letting it get to her, for letting someone she barely knew occupy so much space in her heart. "Claire?" The sound of his voice made her heart jump, and she turned to see Daniel standing behind her, his expression uncertain. She forced a smile, though it felt strained. "Daniel, what brings you here?" He walked over, sitting beside her on the sand. He hesitated before speaking, his voice quieter than usual. "I wanted to explain about Sophia." She shook her head, cutting him off. "You don't owe me an explanation, Daniel. It's not like we—" She stopped herself, realizing she didn't want to finish the sentence. "It's not what it looked like," he said, his gaze intent on her. "Sophia and I have known each other for years, but that's it. We're friends, nothing more." She looked down, her fingers digging into the cool sand. "I guess it just reminded me that I don't really belong here, with you, in your world." Daniel's face softened, and he reached out, his hand covering hers. "Don't say that. Last night, it meant something to me, more than you know." Claire's heart twisted, both wanting to believe him and fearing that he was simply trying to ease her doubts. She looked up, searching his gaze for some sign of the man she'd connected with the night before. But before she could speak, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Claire turned to see Sophia approaching, a slight smirk on her lips as she glanced between them. "Oh, there you are," Sophia said breezily, barely glancing at Claire. "Daniel, I was wondering if you'd had a chance to look at the plans I sent over. You know, for the charity gala next month." Daniel's hand slipped from Claire's and he stood up, his posture shifting back into that of the poised, unreachable host. "Yes, of course," he replied, his tone polite yet distant. Claire felt her heart sink, the moment slipping through her fingers as quickly as sand. She stood as well, brushing off her hands, feeling more out of place than ever. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She turned away before she could see his expression, her chest tight with frustration, and a quiet, gnawing pain she didn't want to examine. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She found herself replaying every interaction with Daniel, each moment tinged with doubt and uncertainty. Part of her wanted to believe that last night had been real, that she hadn't imagined the connection they'd shared. But another part, the part that had learned to guard her heart, whispered that maybe she'd been foolish to think she could fit into his life, even for a weekend. Later that evening, she was wandering through one of the estate's quieter wings when she spotted Daniel leaning against a window, looking out at the garden. He seemed lost in thought, his expression shadowed, and for a moment, she felt the urge to go to him, to reach out and remind him of what they'd shared. But she stopped herself, feeling a heaviness settle over her heart. She didn't want to be just another momentary distraction, someone he turned to when he felt alone. She wanted to be more than that, and she didn't know if he was willing to give her that chance. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the silence. The next morning, Claire tried to lose herself in the estate's sprawling gardens, hoping that the fresh air would calm her racing thoughts. The previous day's events played on a loop in her mind. Daniel's quiet explanations, his sudden distance, Sophia's lingering presence. It all felt like a cruel reminder of how impossible it was to fit into a world where everything, including relationships, seemed polished and planned. She wandered through rows of roses, letting her fingers graze the soft petals, trying to focus on the small, grounding details. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the lingering ache in her chest, the feeling that something between her and Daniel had broken. As she turned a corner near the fountain, she nearly collided with him. He was there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, the space between them charged with tension. "Claire," he finally said, his voice low and careful, as if afraid she might slip away. "I've been looking for you." She forced a polite smile, trying to mask the hurt she felt. "Well, here I am." He hesitated, his eyes searching her face. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I should have been more clear with Sophia. I didn't mean for it to seem like something it wasn't." Claire crossed her arms, the words coming out before she could stop them. "It's not just about Sophia, Daniel. It's about feeling like I don't belong here. Like this whole weekend has been a reminder of just how different our lives are." A flicker of frustration crossed his face, and he took a step closer. "Why do you keep saying that? Why do you think you don't belong?" "Because I'm not like you," she replied, her voice breaking. "I didn't grow up with any of this. To me, wealth was something other people had, something I'd see in movies and magazines. This isn't my world." Daniel's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand. "Claire, just because our lives are different doesn't mean they can't come together. I've spent my whole life in this world, and I've never felt more disconnected from it than I do now. You're the first person who's made me question if this is what I want." She searched his eyes, feeling the walls around her heart begin to crumble. "Daniel, I don't want to be a phase. I don't want to be something you'll look back on as a moment of rebellion." He tightened his grip on her hand, his voice steady. "You're not a phase, Claire. Last night, when I was with you, I felt something real. Something I haven't felt in years." Claire looked down, her defenses melting under his gaze. "Then why did you pull away?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I'm scared, Claire. I'm scared of what this could mean. I've spent my life hiding behind walls, keeping people at a distance because it was easier than letting them see who I really am." She softened, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "You don't have to hide with me, Daniel. I see you, the real you, and that's enough." He took a shaky breath, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. I've built this life around the idea that wealth and power were enough, that they'd protect me from the pain of letting someone in. But you've shown me that there's more to life than just existing in this world." Without another word, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded. She let herself melt into him, her head resting against his chest, feeling his heartbeat thudding beneath her cheek. They stayed like that, holding each other in the quiet of the garden, letting the weight of their emotions sink in. After a moment, Daniel pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw honesty she hadn't seen before. "Claire, I want to be with you. Not just for a weekend, not just for a moment. I want something real, something lasting." Her heart raced, and she felt a surge of hope. "Are you sure? Because I don't want to lose myself trying to fit into your life." He nodded, his expression resolute. "I don't want you to change. I want you as you are. I want this, whatever it is we're building, to be real, to be ours." Claire felt tears prick her eyes, and she laughed softly, a sense of relief and joy flooding her. "Then let's figure it out together. We'll take it one step at a time." Daniel leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a gentle, tender kiss. It was a promise, a vow between them that this was more than just a fleeting romance. This was the beginning of something real, something that neither of them had anticipated, but both desperately wanted. As they walked hand in hand through the garden, Claire felt a new sense of clarity. This weekend, this place, it was more than just a brush with wealth and luxury. It was a chance to break free from the limitations she'd placed on herself, to embrace the possibility that her life could be bigger than she'd ever dreamed. They reached a secluded bench near a grove of old oak trees, and they sat together, the quiet of the garden surrounding them like a gentle embrace. Daniel looked at her, a hint of vulnerability still in his eyes. "There's something I've wanted to ask you," he began, his voice soft. Claire arched a brow, curious. "Go ahead." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. "What would it take for you to consider staying?" Her heart skipped a beat, the question catching her off guard. "Staying?" He looked up, his eyes earnest. "I don't mean forever, but maybe a little longer. I don't want this weekend to end with a goodbye." Claire felt a rush of emotions, excitement, fear, hope, all tangled together. "Daniel, I have a life back home. My bakery, my friends." "I know," he said quickly, his grip tightening. "And I would never ask you to give that up. But maybe we could find a way to make this work. A way for you to keep your life, and for us to see where this goes." She looked at him, her heart swelling at the sincerity in his gaze. "You're serious, aren't you?" He nodded, his expression unwavering. "I've never been more serious about anything. You've changed me, Claire. You've made me see that there's more to life than just surviving." Claire felt her resolve waver, the thought of leaving him tugging at her heart. She'd spent her life believing that wealth and privilege created a barrier she could never cross. But with Daniel, those walls seemed to crumble. For the first time, she could imagine a life that stretched beyond her bakery, one that held the possibility of a love as real and lasting as she'd always dreamed. "Let's try," she whispered, feeling a surge of hope. "Let's see where this takes us." He smiled, relief washing over his face, and he kissed her again, a gentle but passionate promise that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. In that moment, Claire knew that she was no longer afraid of what the future held. With Daniel by her side, she was ready to step into a world that was both thrilling and terrifying. A world where love and possibility stretched as wide as the horizon. The next morning, Claire was on her way to meet Daniel for breakfast when she noticed an envelope slipped under her door. She picked it up, turning it over curiously. Her name was scrawled across the front in neat, formal handwriting. Intrigued, she opened it, finding an official-looking document from the Sinclair Foundation. Her eyes scanned the page, her heart dropping as she took in the words. The document revealed that her invitation to the estate, the luxury weekend she had thought was a random prize, was actually part of a program funded by the Sinclair Foundation. In fact, she hadn't won a contest at all. She had been chosen. Chosen. Her mind reeled as she tried to process the implications. She wasn't here by luck or coincidence. Daniel had orchestrated her presence. This whole experience, the opulent weekend, the moments they had shared, the growing feelings between them, was all based on a decision he'd made without her even knowing. She dropped the letter onto the table, her hands trembling as a mix of anger, confusion, and hurt swirled within her. How could he not tell her? After everything they'd shared, all the moments when he'd encouraged her to be vulnerable, he had been hiding this. And now, all those questions, all her lingering doubts, resurfaced with a vengeance. She needed answers. When she found Daniel, he was standing in the garden, hands in his pockets, looking out over the cliffs. He turned as she approached, a warm smile lighting his face, a smile that faded the instant he saw the look in her eyes. "Claire?" he asked, a touch of concern in his voice. She held up the document, her voice shaking. "Care to explain this?" He looked down, his expression shifting from confusion to realization as he recognized the paper in her hand. He took a slow, steadying breath, as if bracing himself. "Claire, I can explain." "Please do," she replied, her tone laced with bitterness. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm not here because of any chance. It looks like you arranged all of this without even telling me. Why?" Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he looked away. "It wasn't meant to be a secret. The Foundation sometimes offers these weekends to people who wouldn't otherwise have the chance. I wanted to give others a taste of what life could be like if they didn't have to worry about limits." "Then why not tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this feels? I thought I was here because I'd won something, because I was chosen by chance. But it turns out I was picked, like a name off a list. You were choosing who deserved to be here, as if you could play God with people's lives." "It wasn't like that, Claire," he replied, his voice tense. "When we started this program, it was meant to bring genuine, unguarded people into my life. People who saw me for who I am, not just my wealth." She shook her head, her heart pounding with anger and betrayal. "So this whole weekend, all of this, it was just an experiment to you?" "No," he said sharply, stepping closer. "It wasn't an experiment. When I met you, none of this mattered anymore. I wanted you to be here because I felt a connection, because I wanted to know you. And the more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I needed you in my life." Claire let out a bitter laugh, tears stinging her eyes. "You say you wanted to be real with me, but you kept me in the dark about something this huge. Don't you understand how that makes me feel? How am I supposed to trust anything you've said if I don't know what else you've kept from me?" He reached for her hand, his expression pleading. "Claire, please. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I thought if you knew, it would ruin everything. I was afraid you'd see me as someone who controls everything, someone who manipulates situations to get what he wants." Her voice softened, but the hurt remained. "But that's exactly what you did, Daniel. You took away my choice. I deserve to know the truth." His hand dropped, and he looked down, guilt etched in every line of his face. "You're right," he murmured. "You did deserve to know. I was selfish. I wanted to keep you here, in my world, without risking that you might walk away." She took a shaky breath, searching his face, hoping for some sign that would make the betrayal feel less raw, less painful. But all she could see was a man who was deeply, profoundly flawed. Someone who had hidden a fundamental truth because he'd been too afraid to be vulnerable himself. "I don't know if I can stay, Daniel," she said quietly, the words tearing at her heart as she spoke them. This changes everything." He looked up, desperation in his eyes. "Claire, please, don't walk away. Give me a chance to make it right, to show you that I want this, want us, more than anything I've ever had in my life." She shook her head, tears spilling over. "I need time. I need to figure out if I can trust you, if I can believe in what we shared." He swallowed, nodding slowly, though she could see the anguish in his eyes. "Take all the time you need, but please, don't close the door on us, Claire. Don't close the door on what we could be." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heart aching with every step. She could feel his gaze on her back, the silent plea in his eyes begging her to turn around, to give him one more chance. But she kept walking, needing distance, needing space to clear her head, to decide if the man she thought she knew was still someone she could trust. As she reached the edge of the garden, she looked back, just once, to find him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his expression filled with regret. She turned away, feeling the weight of her own heart breaking, uncertain if there was any way to repair the fracture between them. The evening stretched on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Claire retreated to her room, pacing by the window as she tried to piece together her swirling emotions. She wanted to be furious with Daniel, to let her anger drown out the pangs of sadness that gnawed at her heart. But instead, she felt trapped in a whirlwind of conflicting feelings: anger, hurt, and somewhere beneath it all, an undeniable longing for the man she'd glimpsed beneath his guarded exterior. Unable to stand the quiet any longer, she left her room and wandered down the hallways of the estate, letting her feet carry her through dim corridors and past grand, empty rooms. As she walked, she found herself back in the library, the place where they'd first shared their secrets, their vulnerabilities. She remembered the way he'd spoken of his mother, the quiet, hidden ache he carried from a life spent as more of a symbol than a person. It was that Daniel she missed, that Daniel she wished she could trust. And as if her thoughts had summoned him, she heard his footsteps, soft yet deliberate, approaching from the doorway. She looked up, her heart lurching at the sight of him standing there, his face etched with regret and longing. "Claire," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I was hoping I might find you here." She crossed her arms, steeling herself. "Why? So you can explain how you kept something this big from me?" He took a slow, steady breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "I deserve that. I deserve every ounce of your anger, your disappointment. But please, just hear me out." Her jaw clenched, but she nodded, giving him the space to speak. Daniel stepped closer, his expression raw, his voice unsteady. "I grew up in a world where control was everything. Every moment, every decision, every person, all of it was supposed to serve the life I'd been handed. I was never allowed to make mistakes, never allowed to be vulnerable." He hesitated, searching her face. "Then I met you, and for the first time in my life, I wanted to let someone in, to let myself be seen." Her heart softened, but the hurt remained. "Then why didn't you just tell me the truth? Why keep me in the dark?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you'd see me as someone who manipulates, someone who hides behind wealth and power to get what he wants. I didn't want to be that man with you, Claire. I wanted you to see me, the real me." She felt her defenses falter, his words chipping away at her anger. "But don't you understand?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "By hiding this, you became exactly that man, the one who controls, who decides things without thinking about how it affects the people around him." He looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. "You're right," he murmured, his voice rough with regret. "I was selfish. I wanted you here, in my world, but I was too afraid to trust that you'd want to be here if you knew the truth. I took away your choice, and I can't undo that." They stood in silence, the truth of his admission hanging between them like a delicate thread. For a moment, Claire thought about leaving, about walking away from the man who'd betrayed her trust. But she remembered the look in his eyes when he'd spoken of his mother, the vulnerability he'd shown her in quiet, unguarded moments. She couldn't deny that she still cared for him, that a part of her wanted to believe in the man he was trying to become. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice softening, "I want to believe you. I want to believe that we can be real. But you need to understand that trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight." He nodded, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. I know it won't be easy, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But if there's any chance, any part of you that's willing to try, I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself to you." Claire looked down, her heart waging a quiet battle between her lingering doubts and the pull she felt toward him. She knew she couldn't make a decision in that moment, that it would take time for her to truly believe that he was ready to be vulnerable, to let her in without conditions or hidden motives. "I need to see that you mean it," she said finally, her voice steady. "I need to know that you're willing to let go of the control, to let things be messy and real." Daniel's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, reaching for her hand. She let him take it, feeling the warmth of his touch, the quiet strength that still managed to make her feel safe. "I'll do whatever it takes," he promised, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'll prove to you that I can be that man, the man you deserve. I don't want to lose you, Claire." She looked up at him, her heart softening in spite of the pain. "Then show me, Daniel. Show me that you're ready to be honest, to let go of the need to control everything." He nodded, his expression resolute, and she could see the determination in his eyes, the quiet vow that he was willing to change, willing to fight for whatever they could build together. And in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, a tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal the wounds between them. Without another word, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as if he never wanted to let go. She rested her head against his chest, letting herself take comfort in his embrace, in the promise that, this time, he was willing to be the man who was real, who was vulnerable, who was ready to let her in. The morning light filtered softly through the windows as Claire sat on the terrace overlooking the ocean, her mind calmer than it had been in days. After their conversation in the library, she'd sensed a change in Daniel. He'd spent the past 2 days making quiet, genuine gestures, all without any trace of the control or pretense that had once marked his actions. There were no grand, sweeping attempts to win her back. Instead, he simply showed up, day by day, with a humble sincerity that was slowly mending the cracks in her heart. As she watched the waves crash gently against the shore, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his expression soft yet determined. He looked different somehow, as though he'd finally shed the weight of the expectations that had once held him back. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone tentative. She smiled, gesturing to the seat beside her. "Please." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. Finally, he turned to her, his gaze earnest. "Claire, I know I've asked you for a lot, and I know it'll take time for you to trust me again. But I want you to know that whatever it takes, I'm willing to do it. I'm not the same person I was when you first walked into this place. You've changed me, in ways I didn't even know I needed." She looked down, feeling her heart swell with a mixture of hope and caution. "Daniel, I believe that you're trying, and I believe that you care about me. But this isn't something I can just rush into." He nodded, his face softening. "I understand. I don't expect you to decide everything now. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'll be here, whether it takes weeks, months, or longer." Her chest tightened, but it was a good feeling, a reminder that perhaps he really was willing to let go of the control he'd once clung to so tightly. She reached out, taking his hand, letting their fingers intertwine. "Then let's take it one step at a time. No expectations, no rushing, just seeing where this goes." His smile was one of quiet relief, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "That sounds perfect." They sat like that, fingers entwined, letting the quiet promise settle between them, a new foundation built on honesty and vulnerability. As they watched the waves, Claire felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something real in the most unexpected place. After a moment, Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a spark she hadn't seen before. "Would you like to take a walk on the beach with me? Just us, no pretenses." She smiled, a warmth filling her chest. "I'd like that." They walked side by side along the shore, their footsteps trailing behind them in the sand. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of his world pressing down on her. Instead, they felt like equals, two people learning to understand each other without the barriers of wealth, status, or expectation. As they walked, he told her stories of his mother, the woman who had once been the heart of this place, the person who had taught him to see beyond the surface. And Claire shared stories of her own, of her parents, her love for baking, the little dreams she'd once had that had been set aside as life took its course. It was a different kind of connection, one that felt solid, rooted in reality. When they finally returned to the estate, Daniel stopped, turning to her with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Claire, for giving me a chance to learn how to be just me." She looked up at him, feeling her heart full and certain. "And thank you, Daniel, for showing me that love doesn't have to come with conditions." He leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was soft, tender, and filled with the promise of something real. In that moment, Claire knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together, one step at a time. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. This is Blackwood Estate, a mansion packed with secrets, a massive inheritance on the line, and two total strangers who have to live here together for a year to keep it all. But they can't just survive the year. They have to uncover the mansion's hidden past, protect its legacy, and find a way to work together.